In the shadows of New Orleans' winding alleyways and the mist that rolls off the Mississippi, there are stories that locals whisper about, but never fully explain. One of these stories is so disturbing, so steeped in betrayal and greed, that even the oldest residents hesitate when the subject comes up. It begins in the late 1800s, a time when wealth and poverty rubbed shoulders violently, and appearances were everything. A woman named Marguerite Leclerc, known in her small neighborhood for her striking beauty and sharp wit, made a choice that would forever taint her name. Marguerite had a newborn daughter, fragile and pale, and yet in her eyes, this child was a burden she could not bear. There are conflicting accounts of why she made the decision, but one detail is chillingly consistent. She sold her baby, not for survival, not for money to feed herself, but for a single pair of pearls. Pearls that gleamed with a cold, unnatural lust, like they held their own secrets. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The buyer was a wealthy collector of curiosities, a man whose mansion was said to be lined with the bodies of animals, artifacts, and items most would not touch. He was a figure shrouded in rumor, whispered to delight in the macabre. And Marguerite, in the desperate twilight of her ambition, handed over her daughter, leaving the child to a life she could never have imagined. As the years passed, Marguerite's once lovely face became haunted, her beauty warped by guilt and the unyielding pressure of hiding such a dark secret. Friends reported seeing her mutter to herself in corners of the city, shadows clinging to her like old friends. No one could have foreseen, however, that fate has a way of circling back in the most grotesque and ironic ways. The story takes a turn into the realm of the uncanny, when, decades later, Marguerite would cross paths with the very man she had sold her child to, under circumstances that defy reason, morality, and time itself. What happened next is recorded only in fragmented court documents, obscure letters, and the hushed recollections of those who claimed to witness the events. And what we know paints a picture so dark it is almost impossible to digest. The buyer and Marguerite met again, but not in the sunlight, not in the bustling streets of New Orleans, but somewhere far more sinister. The years that followed Marguerite's unthinkable decision were marked by whispers and an ever-thickening veil of secrecy. New Orleans, with all its grandeur and decay, seemed to absorb the guilt that Marguerite carried, allowing it to fester in quiet corners, in the cracks of worn cobblestones, and behind shuttered windows where nobody dared peek. The child she sold, a little girl named Emilienne, by her new owner, grew up in a mansion that was more prison than home. Reports describe her as pale, fragile, and strangely introspective, wandering the halls alone, speaking only to the shadows and to the porcelain dolls that lined the shelves like silent witnesses. The buyer treated her as both treasure and experiment, keeping her life confined within strict, unnerving routines, all under the veneer of opulence. Marguerite, meanwhile, descended further into her own private hell. She married, had other children, but none brought the peace or satisfaction she sought. Her beauty, once celebrated in the parlors of the city, became warped, the guilt-etched lines too deep to conceal. Friends and neighbors noted her increasing agitation, her sudden disappearances into the fog-laden streets, and her obsession with fortune and status. Some say she began attending spiritualists, desperate to glimpse the daughter she had traded away, to see if she could undo what she had done. But the spirits spoke only in riddles and shadows. The intersection of these two lives, the mother who sold her child and the girl who was sold, remained unseen by the world. But the universe, indifferent to human morality, yet strangely poetic in its cruelty, had other plans. There are records, hidden in old newspapers and family letters, suggesting that Emilienne was not only aware of her origins, but harbored a cold, calculating memory of her mother's betrayal. By the time she reached adolescence, she reportedly displayed a demeanor that unsettled even the servants. Silent stares that seemed to penetrate walls, a voice that could chill even the bravest visitor, and a fascination with objects that were as grotesque as her upbringing. The stage was being quietly set for a reunion unlike anything New Orleans or the world had ever witnessed. No photograph, no sketch captures the quiet horror of these moments. What remains are accounts layered with suspicion, the kind that make one wonder if the story itself has absorbed the darkness it describes. Marguerite, never knowing when fate would strike, was slowly, inexorably walking toward a reckoning that would force her to face the life she had discarded in pursuit of greed and fleeting beauty. And in the shadows of the city, a young girl with a past wrapped in pearls was growing into the agent of that reckoning. The first documented encounter between Marguerite and Emilienne occurred under circumstances that almost defy belief. It was said to have happened at a charity ball, a glittering affair in the French Quarter, where New Orleans' elite mingled, oblivious to the creeping dread that would unfold. Marguerite, now a woman in her late 30s, arrived dressed in silk and lace, her beauty shadowed by tension lines etched deep into her face. She believed the event would be innocuous, perhaps even a distraction from her ever-growing anxiety. But as she navigated the crowded ballroom, her eyes caught a figure across the room, a young woman whose presence seemed to warp the air itself. Emilienne, the girl she had sold for pearls, the daughter she had abandoned. The accounts of their initial reaction are fragmented, pieced together from letters, second-hand newspaper reports, and diaries from those present. Some recall Marguerite's face draining of color as she realized who Emilienne was. Others describe Emilienne's expression as calm, almost chillingly composed, as if she had anticipated this moment for years. When their eyes met, it was as though time itself held its breath. The tension in the room was palpable. Chandeliers flickered, the music faltered, and even the most indifferent onlookers sensed that something profoundly unnatural was unfolding. Emilienne reportedly approached her mother with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. Every step seemed measured, every glance loaded with accusation. Marguerite tried to speak, to offer some excuse, some explanation that might absolve her of the past. But Emilienne's voice, low and measured, carried a coldness that left the ballroom frozen in silence. She did not scream. She did not cry. Instead, she revealed the full scope of her upbringing, the psychological torment she had endured, and the macabre collection of objects her embrouillé father collector had amassed, which included items that once belonged to other children. The revelation sent shivers down the spines of those listening, an invisible chill that seemed to whisper of curses, of debts unpaid, of a darkness that could not be undone. By the end of that night, Marguerite left the ballroom, a shell of the woman who had entered, haunted not only by the daughter she had sold, but by the realization that fate had given her no escape. And Emilienne, a figure who had grown in shadow and secrecy, returned to the mansion where she had spent her formative years, leaving whispers in her wake, whispers that would haunt New Orleans long after the last candle flickered out. What happened after that fateful reunion is where the story shifts from disturbing to outright terrifying. Marguerite, racked with guilt and fear, tried to reclaim some sense of control over her life, but the shadow of Emilienne loomed larger than ever, Locals began reporting strange occurrences around Marguerite's residence, windows rattling without wind, faint whispers that spoke in voices both familiar and foreign, and fleeting glimpses of a pale figure moving just beyond the edge of vision. Friends who visited her noted her increasingly erratic behavior. She would stare at nothing, clutch pearls as if they were talismans, and mutter about debts that could never be repaid. Emilienne, on the other hand, became a legend in her own right. Some say she took to wandering the French Quarter at night, a spectral presence who observed her mother from afar. Others recall seeing her at the mansion's windows, staring out with eyes that seemed to penetrate the very souls of passers-by. Letters recovered decades later hint at a deliberate psychological campaign. Emilienne ensuring her mother's anxiety was never far from her mind, a slow, inexorable haunting that blended morality with madness. It was as if the universe had allowed Emilienne to act as a living instrument of retribution, one that demanded acknowledgement of the life Marguerite had abandoned. In the most harrowing accounts, there are reports of a dinner party where Marguerite fainted mid-conversation, claiming she saw Emilienne seated in a chair that had been empty moments before. Guests described the pall of dread that settled over the room, the temperature dropping inexplicably, and the chandelier swaying as though caught in an invisible storm. Others heard the faint sound of pearls clinking together, though Marguerite had taken every precaution to lock away her precious jewelry. These incidents were dismissed by the psychological toll on Marguerite was nearly unbearable. Friends who once admired her for her beauty and charm now avoided her, claiming that a sense of malevolence hung about her like a cloud. Some even said they could feel it brush past them when they entered her home, as if the air itself carried whispers of the betrayal she had committed decades earlier. She became obsessed with tracking Emilienne, attempting to control the narrative that fate had thrown into her lap. Each street, each shadowed corner of New Orleans seemed to conspire against her, reminding her that there was no escape from the consequences of her actions. Meanwhile, Emilienne grew increasingly enigmatic. Letters suggest she moved with intent, carefully orchestrating encounters with her mother to ensure the psychological pressure remained unrelenting. It is said that she would appear unexpectedly, her face pale but composed, eyes unnervingly calm, as if calculating exactly how much fear and regret she could instill without tipping over into overt confrontation. Some who witnessed her reported that she seemed older than her years, as though carrying the weight of a lifetime of secrets and suffering. Her presence blurred the line between reality and nightmare, leaving those who crossed her path questioning whether she was entirely human or a living embodiment of karmic vengeance. It is around this time that stories of small, almost ritualistic acts began surfacing. Marguerite's neighbors recall faint clinking noises at night, the sound of pearls shifting on their own, and fleeting glimpses of shadows moving in ways that defied logic. At one point, Marguerite reportedly attempted to bury a set of pearls deep in the backyard, only to dig them up hours later, inexplicably placed back on her dresser. And yet, the most chilling aspect of this period was not the material disturbances, but the quiet terror that Marguerite experienced in isolation. It was a slow, persistent unraveling of her mind, a psychological punishment that no court could enforce, no lawyer could explain, and no society could condone. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Consider the eerie precision of fate, the way the past can seep into the present, and the notion that some wrongs are never allowed to rest quietly. Marguerite's story is a dark mirror reflecting a truth that many refuse to acknowledge, that betrayal, no matter how long ago, carries a weight that can follow us to the very end of our days. And Emilienne, the daughter she sold for pearls, remained the ghostly force ensuring that no corner of Marguerite's life was ever free from reckoning. The final confrontation between Marguerite and Emilienne approached like a storm gathering over the Mississippi. By now, Marguerite had become a shadow of her former self, her once radiant beauty replaced by gaunt cheeks, restless eyes, and a perpetual tremor in her hands. Locals whispered that she had begun to speak to herself in fragmented sentences, recalling details of the past she could barely bear to utter aloud. Meanwhile, Emilienne's presence grew ever more pronounced, no longer a fleeting apparition, but a looming force in Marguerite's life. Every decision, every step the mother took, seemed to be observed, measured, and manipulated by her daughter, who had become the architect of Marguerite's torment. Accounts vary as to what precipitated the final encounter, but one story emerges repeatedly. Marguerite, in a desperate attempt to reclaim some control, arranged a private meeting with Emilienne in the quiet of an old family estate. The room was dim, illuminated only by a single candle, whose flame danced as though alive. Marguerite attempted to speak, her voice quivering with shame, her words barely coherent as she offered excuses, apologies, and tears. Emilienne, pale and poised, listened in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb the light around them. Then she spoke, not with anger, but with the cold precision of someone who has counted every betrayal and has measured every ounce of pain. Her words were simple yet devastating. She had no intention of forgiveness, only recognition, and a reckoning that would leave Marguerite unable to hide from the consequences of her choices. Witnesses outside the estate described a strange stillness that hung over the surrounding streets, a quiet that swallowed the sounds of the city. Some claimed they could hear pearls clinking, though no one entered the house. Others reported a flickering candle visible through the wind, bayous, moving as if guided by unseen hands. By the time the confrontation ended, Marguerite had vanished from public life, retreating into isolation, her wealth and social connections powerless against the weight of her own guilt. Emilienne, meanwhile, assumed an almost spectral role in the city's lore, a living reminder of the consequences that accompany greed, betrayal, and the abuse of trust. The tale of Marguerite and Emilienne would endure long after both women passed from the world, preserved in letters, newspaper fragments, and oral accounts, whispered by families, too fearful to record the truth fully. It became less a story of mother and daughter than a cautionary legend, warning of the darkness that lingers when greed outweighs love, and when a single decision, no matter how long ago, shapes the lives of generations to come. Even after the deaths of Marguerite and Emilienne, the story lingered in New Orleans like a persistent shadow, impossible to fully dispel. Historians and folklorists who attempted to document the tale noted that every source, letters, diaries, fragmented newspaper articles, hinted at the same unsettling pattern. Betrayal, greed, and a daughter sold for pearls had left a mark not only on the family, but on the very air of the city. Visitors reported feeling inexplicable coldness in the streets, once inhabited by Marguerite, and descendants spoke in hushed tones of a presence that watched silently from the corners of rooms or from blurred reflections in mirrors. The pearls themselves, strange and unnatural, became objects of fascination and fear. Some accounts claim they were eventually returned to the family estate, only to disappear again under mysterious circumstances. They were said to glint with an eerie light, even in darkness, as if holding within them the memory of Emilienne's pain and Marguerite's guilt. Paranormal investigators who visited the mansion decades later reported sudden temperature drops, faint whispering, and the inexplicable movement of small objects, often described as resembling pearls, rolling across floors that had long been swept clean. What makes this story truly haunting is its universality. While Marguerite and Emilienne are real names, tied to specific events in New Orleans, their tale echoes a broader truth about human behavior. The cost of greed, the consequences of moral compromise, and the way our choices reverberate far beyond our lifetimes. It is a dark mirror, reflecting the depths of human ambition and the shadow of remorse. Some suggest that Emilienne's presence transcended death itself, continuing to haunt the estate and the city as a reminder that some debts can never be settled. For those brave enough to dwell on the story, it says a single chilling question. Could you face a past so twisted, a secret so unforgivable, and a descendant so relentless? Could you live knowing that a single act of betrayal could haunt generations? Marguerite's life ended in quiet isolation, and Emilienne's legacy became legend, a tale passed down in whispers, in warnings, and in the faintest clinking of pearls in the dead of night. In the end, their story is a reminder that the sins of the past are never truly buried, and that the past often finds a way to meet us, even in the darkest corners of our existence.